The strongest elements of the prosecution's case, where the defense may be going in the murder of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. It's the Leonard Files podcast for Friday, July 31st. I'm Eric Leonard, investigative reporter at NBC Los Angeles. I've had a few days to sort of digest nearly the week that I spent at criminal courts listening to all of the presentation of the evidence in the case against David Burke, the singer known as David D4VD. And I didn't want to record this right after the conclusion of the preliminary hearing on Monday, one, because I was sick, but also because I really needed to think about everything that had been said in court. There was so much information, and it happened sort of so quickly that it was difficult to put it all in perspective about what it is that really forms the core of the prosecution's evidence that it says connects David Burke to Celeste Rivas Hernandez's death, and a little bit of insight into where the defense will go, assuming this case goes to trial. Kind of the things that really stood out the most. And as for the defense, sort of their approach to challenging the evidence, at least the evidence we've seen so far, that will eventually come into a trial, assuming the case goes to trial. That's where everything's headed right now. The prosecution put on a dozen witnesses over 5 days. That, in my experience, is a little bit long for a preliminary hearing. Most of them are shorter. And oftentimes they're shorter because under the law in California, detectives, the investigating person in the case, is allowed to summarize a lot of the information that comes into court rather than having to call each individual witness to present. So there's a little bit of leeway there, and that usually makes these things a lot shorter. This was obviously a very deliberate decision by the LA County District Attorney's Office to put on this public hearing and present all of the elements of this case in a very public way in such detail. We've seen the DA's office opt for a grand jury indictment as opposed to preliminary hearings in some of the murder cases that have drawn a lot of public attention. That's the alternative path. Preliminary hearings are generally required unless there's a grand jury indictment. And if there's an indictment, there is no preliminary hearing, and the substance of the case remains under seal behind closed doors, generally until a trial begins. So this was a decision to put this on in public. And I don't want to go back through all of the stuff, all of the information and the testimony that went on over those 5 days. We covered it extensively on TV. You can go back through some of our coverage. I think you can see here if you want to. But I thought I would now, having a few days to consider what was presented, go back and look at some of the standout elements of the prosecution's case. And maybe it helps all of us understand what's going on here. David Burke was in court each day, and I know you know this by now, but he's charged with the first-degree murder of Celeste Rivas Hernandez, which happened when she was 14 years old. Authorities suspect she died on April 23rd to 24th, 2025, probably April 23rd. And that first-degree murder charge also carries 3 special circumstance allegations. One of them is lying in wait. Another one is a murder to prevent a witness's testimony, and the third is murder for financial gain. The defense tried to challenge all of these unsuccessfully at the conclusion of the preliminary hearing. And of course, Burke is also charged with the continuous sexual abuse of a minor child and a felony charge for the mutilation of remains. And before we get started, I should mention that some of the descriptions and the material that we'll address may be upsetting. So one of the major witnesses that testified during the preliminary hearing was an LAPD detective named Joshua Byers. He was one of the 2 lead investigators on the case. The other name you'll hear is Corey Farrell. The 2 of them are partners at the LAPD's robbery homicide squad, and they were the ones that were called to the tow yard in Hollywood on the day that the remains were discovered, and eventually made the big decisions in the case about how to proceed with the investigation. The testimony each of them gave addressed different areas of the case. Both of them were important, but they may not have addressed some of the things that I found, again, in thinking back about this after a couple of days, to be some of the more compelling parts. So let me focus in on a couple of things that really stand out to me now as maybe more significant than they sounded at the beginning. One of them is the testimony of a guy named Benjamin Gregor, and he is a music industry business manager who at first worked for David Burke's management company. You'll hear the name come up probably if you've been following this, called Mogul Vision, a company that was being run out of Florida but was managing his blossoming music industry empire. And even after he worked for that management company, and it seems like that company is now defunct, but maybe not, Gregor continues to work directly for the Burke family, specifically for David Burke's mother, Colleen, and he's helping them manage the business of his music career, even with all that's happened in the last few months with the criminal charges and the what seems to be the trial. So the prosecution brought him in to address one of the key factors in the case. Remember, one of the special circumstances is murder for financial gain. And in order to establish that, what the prosecution is really trying to show is not that Burke would have made money from the death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. They're alleging that he would have missed out on future earnings had his career been interrupted by what they say were her allegations that Burke was carrying on an unlawful relationship with a child, which is something that she threatened. Of course, we covered that as well. And the prosecution, again, is trying to get him, Gregor, to testify about everything he knows about the mechanics and business behind D4VD Enterprises, the performance and recording contracts. And Gregor testifies he's earning millions of dollars and had the potential to earn millions more. But that wasn't what I thought was the most significant piece of his testimony, even though this didn't seem this way necessarily when we first heard it in court. Gregor testifies that in September of 2025, and the chronology is important here, after Celeste's body was found, but long before Burke was arrested or charged, Gregor was working with Burke's mother, Colleen, to try to move money around to raise what they thought would be bail in the event that Burke got arrested. And they were trying to make about $2 million in cash available. And he talked about the different accounts. There was a brokerage account and the properties that he had bought. And David Burke had purchased 2 properties in Texas. That's where he's from. That's where his parents live. There are 2 homes there. One of them that they had purchased previously that he paid off, and then a second one that they bought after his success in the music world. And Gregor testified that not only were they moving assets around to free up money for bail, assuming that David Burke would be arrested at some point, but also to protect the family's assets from an anticipated wrongful death lawsuit. So this is Deputy District Attorney Beth Silverman questioning. She's the prosecutor on the case. Benjamin Gregor, who is on the witness stand. He's a witness for the prosecution, but he still has a deep financial relationship with the guy on trial and that guy's family. So to say he was a little slippery on the witness stand is an understatement, but the questioning was contentious. So Silverman asks a question. You were helping move money around for bail. Answer. Correct. Then she says, did you tell her, meaning Burke's mother, Colleen, to change the title on this house from David's name to her name? Answer, yes. Question, why? Answer, the understanding was that the Hempstead house, this is in Hempstead, Texas, was for the family, so we moved the title. Question, do you remember testifying it was so the victim's family would not be able to get access to that money? Answer, I do recall that, yes. So, Burke's money manager, his mother, and others were trying to move assets around to shield themselves from a potential lawsuit brought by Celeste's parents. And if the timeline is accurate, September 2025, they were doing this long before he'd been publicly accused, let alone faced criminal charges or a trial for her death. And this really raises questions for Colleen Burke, his mother, and others, and David Burke, about what he had told his family and his manager and everybody about what had happened. And not that we're ever going to get answers to this, but I imagine this is why some of these people were brought before a grand jury and questioned under oath during the investigation. Remember, the question from Silverman there is, do you remember testifying? That's a reference to grand jury testimony that this guy gave. She was pointing out all kinds of inconsistencies between the grand jury testimony and what he was saying in court. But if they were making plans to shield themselves from a lawsuit long before he'd been publicly accused of causing her death, that certainly seems to be a pretty significant part of the case. What did they know? What had Burke told them prior to his arrest and the criminal charges in this case about what had happened to Celeste? And keep in mind, from other testimony, Celeste had visited Burke's family's home in Texas long before she died, which means the family knew she existed, probably knew that she was much younger than David Burke. And we also know that Burke had communicated about his relationship with Celeste to his mother, about the nature of the relationship. There were some text messages that were read into the record by the second LAPD detective, Farrell, that certainly seemed to suggest that Burke's mother knew it was a sexual relationship between her adult son and Celeste, the 13-year-old child. So that stands out as a significant potential piece of evidence that the prosecution can bring. Sometimes they call these things consciousness of guilt, things that people who are accused of crimes do that illustrate the fact that they may have known that they had committed a crime, and juries can consider that. The next major thing that stood out to me during the preliminary hearing and the prosecution's presentation of evidence came from an LAPD criminalist, a forensic scientist. Her name is Lisa Lahendro, and she was testifying about the examination of some of the items that were found and collected when the LAPD searched the garage of the home where Burke was living in the Hollywood Hills. They searched it on, I think it was September 17th, 2025. So about a week after Celeste's remains were discovered in Burke's Tesla. And all of the things that were found in the garage that were collected and booked as evidence. And one of them was an inflatable kids pool that was purchased from Amazon in the days after Celeste Rivas visited the Hollywood Hills home and was never heard from again. So the timing of that purchase is important here because it was bought after Celeste was last seen alive, and the detectives then find it when they're searching the home about 5 months later, September 17th, 2025. And when the pool was examined, the criminalist testified that she found some small holes in the top surface of the pool. So if you can imagine a large kids' inflatable pool being inflated, the top part of it had the areas where somebody would go inside to sit in the water or splash around. And the police believe, and certainly the prosecution has alleged, that the pool was inflated and used as a mechanism to contain Celeste's blood when she was either being killed or dismembered. And certainly they found some traces of what might have been blood on the underside of it, but one of the other LAPD criminalists testified that the kids' pool smelled like it had been through the laundry, and they found a dryer sheet inside it, suggesting that it may have been cleaned and washed. But Lahendro, the criminalist who's testifying, who wasn't part of the search, did the comparisons and examination of the pool. And on the top of the pool, she found a number of small cuts in the pool, small holes. And they were, again, in places that would be sort of the upper part of the pool had it been inflated. Now, during the autopsy, where Celeste's remains were examined, the medical examiner found a number of bits of small pieces of blue plastic that were, and again, warning about the nature of all of this, that were found in the incisions, in the cuts that were made to dismember her remains, her limbs. They collected all of these and sent them over to the LAPD. And sure enough, the analyst who's testifying says they looked consistent with the plastic material from the pool. And she began under a microscope and a magnifying glass to compare each of these plastic bits. And they collected a lot of them, but they only looked at about a dozen of them for comparison. I don't know how they decided which ones to compare and which ones not, but they looked at a number of them for comparison. And Lahendro began looking to see if any of those bits from the plastic pool, or any of the holes from the plastic pool, were consistent with the plastic bits that were found during the autopsy. Again, prosecution witness, Deputy DA Beth Silverman asking the questions. Question, tell us what we're looking at, and they put up a picture, they called it Fragment A. Lahendro, in the center of this photo, because they're showing photos, not the actual items, there's an arrow pointing to Fragment A, and either side is the damaged area of the pool. And you can see that the edges of Fragment A align on both sides, and that the surface detail on the top of the pool, in other words, the type of the plastic, also aligns with the surface of the top of the fragment. Question, like pieces of a puzzle? Answer, correct. Question, what did you find on Fragment A? Answer, that it formed a physical fit with the pool in the area. Question, so Fragment A fit into the missing piece of the cut? Answer, correct. Question, so that shows they were both once one object at one time. So, there were 3 pieces from the dozen that she compared that formed a near perfect fit into the holes in the pool. What does this mean? It means that there's little doubt that Celeste was dismembered inside the garage of the home on Doheny, inside the inflatable pool that Burke purchased online and had delivered to that house. And for the prosecution, it means that it brings her death much closer to him than almost any of the other evidence. Now, when you look at all of the evidence that was presented as a whole, it is a very compelling case that the prosecution has put on, not really challenged thoroughly like at a trial by the defense. It's a very compelling circumstantial case. But the fragments from the body that match the missing spots on the pool found in the garage, in the place where they suspect that Celeste was either murdered or dismembered, is a pretty compelling piece of the puzzle. Next, the DNA comparisons. So during the police search in September of 2025, when they're looking around the house for any potential evidence, multiple areas of possible blood were seen by some of the people doing the search. Some of those areas that looked like they could contain blood were tested using what's called a presumptive test. It's a chemical that's put on a giant Q-tip and dabbed into the area. And if that area contains some of the components of blood, the chemical changes color. And if that happened, meaning there's a presumptive test that there could be blood there, those areas were then swabbed a second time to collect potential DNA evidence that was left there. And Celeste's full DNA profile, which the coroner was able to obtain by extracting the profile from her toenail. Burke's complete DNA profile was found after there was a search warrant issued for his DNA. They did a cheek swab called a buccal swab and were able to extract his complete profile. So then a different LAPD DNA or forensic scientist who does DNA comparisons testified that they compared those full profiles, Celeste and from Burke, with each of these items that were collected from the house, mostly in the garage, and then there were a couple from the car that were suspected of being areas where blood was found. And one interesting note here is that the DNA analyst who came to court to testify was somebody who works in the DNA unit at the LAPD, but it's not the person who did the actual casework. They brought her in to testify about the results and the comparisons, but she wasn't the one that did most of the analysis. I'm not sure why that was, but I thought that was interesting. So, at the house, in the garage, there were matches to Celeste's complete DNA profile at 15 different locations, and there was testimony about where these swabs were taken. Some of them were on these rubber mats on the floor of the garage that looked like there was blood. There were spots of blood on what I think was described as a piece of exercise equipment, a rowing machine. There was a charger plug for a Tesla. There was something on that from the garage, which is also where the kiddie pool was found. And based on the comparisons from those 15 locations, the prosecutor, Beth Silverman, asks the DNA analyst, was there a statistical comparison or a match that you can report about whether it was the blood of or the DNA of Celeste Rivas Hernandez? She said, yes, the partial DNA was 20 quadrillion times more likely from Celeste than any other individual on Earth. Obviously, that's a lot more people than exist on the planet Earth or have ever possibly existed at one time. Quadrillion is how many zeros? She said it's a 2 followed by 16 zeros. So there's little doubt Celeste Rivas Hernandez's DNA was in the garage in places where the criminalists who were searching the house believed there was blood. Then also found in the garage, there was a black trash bag with another bag inside and what looked to be cleanup wipes inside the trash bag, inside the inner trash bag, and there were brown stains on the cleanup wipes. So the comparisons were done again. There was a swab of the black trash bag and the outer trash bag. Remember, there were 2. Question, what was the result? Answer, for that item, consistent with a mixture of DNA, 4 contributors, including 2 males, one of which was David Burke, and Celeste Rivas was excluded. Question, so the defendant was found on the outside of the trash bag with the cleanup wipes. Answer, David Burke was included in that mixture profile. Question, cutting from a blood stain on the hand wipes also inside of that trash bag. This is all from that same bag in the garage. Answer, consistent with a single source DNA, female, Celeste Rivas included. The prosecutor asks about the statistic. The partial DNA profile on the wipes in the bag was consistent with Celeste, and it was at least 3 trillion more times likely from Celeste than from any other individual who could exist. So, the upshot of this, it puts their DNA together on what appears to be the leftovers from a cleanup of probably her blood, possibly from a murder, at least from her dismemberment. So now we have another very clear connection between her death and that garage and Burke's DNA. Now, as for the defense, we got a window into where the defense was going based on their cross-examination of the prosecution witnesses, as well as their motion at the end of the preliminary hearing to ask for all of the charges to be dismissed. So it's sort of like we get a little bit of a roadmap into where the defense will go, assuming the case goes to trial. So to start with some of the defense issues, we should go back to the DNA comparisons from the garage and the black trash bag because, as you might imagine, the defense may have some different ideas in mind when it comes to what, at least on its surface, appears to be some pretty inculpatory evidence that puts the death and Burke and Celeste all in one place together in the house he was living in. On the outside of that trash bag, remember I said there was a mixture of DNA, 2 males, one of them is Burke. So the natural question is, who is responsible for the second DNA profile on that bag? And it would certainly stand to reason that the person connected to this bag, which appears connected to the cleanup from her death or dismemberment, that other person could have been involved in either of those events. And the prosecution did not offer any evidence about who that was. So this is the kind of thing the defense could argue to a jury, suggests that somebody else was responsible. And clearly the defense wants to raise the possibility with a jury that somebody else might have killed her, and that maybe there was another reason that Burke got involved in the potential disposal of evidence. Well, I shouldn't say potential. There was definitely a disposal of evidence. There was definitely an attempt to clean up and hide evidence of what happened to her from the authorities. And there were other clues about another person's involvement that the defense will likely point to. If we go back to the testimony of Benjamin Gregor, the business manager, he also said that at one point the music management company had tried to hire a live-in security guard to be in that Doheny home, to keep an eye on David Burke or to protect him or help him out in different ways. This person did not testify at the preliminary hearing. We don't really know a lot about how this person fits into the rest of the case. We don't know if he was around the house at the time Celeste Rivas visited and she died or she was killed. We don't know if he was aware of the murder. We don't know whether he was around when any of these disposal activities took place. However, the security guard's name, I'm not going to use his name because it's not somebody you would know, but the security guard's name also came up a second time at the preliminary hearing. And it was during the testimony of that other LAPD detective, Corey Farrell. He was on the witness stand, again, answering prosecution questions about text message exchanges between Burke and Celeste. And during one of those exchanges, text message exchanges, this is around Valentine's Day 2024, when Celeste, at least according to the text messages, is planning to run away from her parents' home and move in with Burke at the Hollywood Hills home on Doheny. Celeste was living with her parents in Lake Elsinore. And according to the text messages, she's going to run away and live with Burke when she's 13 years old. And Burke messages her that it is this security guard, by name, that's going to assist with her, picking her up from near her parents' home and helping her escape to Burke's home. Now, that really got my attention, because now we know that this person, this security guard who was there to kind of make sure nothing went wrong in the house, is now, I don't want to use the word complicit, but at least assisting Burke with a scheme to get this child away from her parents and into his house, which prosecutors say is part of the evidence of the other crime that's charged here, which is the continuous sexual abuse of a minor. At this time, Burke is, I think, 19 years old, and she's 13. And so this other adult security guard should have known that something untoward was happening here. So you can imagine that if and when this case goes to trial, the defense might try to raise the possibility that this security guard was involved in more of what happened to Celeste than the prosecution alleges. The prosecution, of course, is alleging that all of this is the responsibility of David Burke. All right, next, the defense seemed to be very focused on the lack of specificity on the cause of Celeste Rivas Hernandez's death and really proof of when and how she was murdered. The deputy medical examiner testified about everything that could be discerned from the examination of her remains, but the medical examiner could not say with certainty when she died, how she was killed, or how long she had been left to decompose. There was just way too much deterioration, not going to get into the specifics here, for him to be really specific and exact about any of those answers. And certainly the prosecutor, Beth Silverman, in redirect examination of both the medical examiner and I think one of the other witnesses, suggested the defense here is taking advantage of the fact that the defendant, the man accused, may have benefited, well, I shouldn't even say may, clearly benefits from the length of time between her death and the time of discovery, because it interfered with the ordinary things that the medical examiner would be able to state with certainty about not only the cause of her death, but some of the other things that happened. So it's almost like by hiding a body for a long period of time, it becomes easier to get away with a murder, if that's what happened, because all of the typical indicators that would be really helpful in explaining someone's violent death become more difficult to observe. So on cross-examination, not only does the defense point all of this out, but they start raising issues that had not come into the hearing prior to this. One, Celeste could have caused her own fatal injuries. On cross-examination, they said, well, you don't know that she didn't inflict these two wounds. And the medical examiner testified that she could have died from either one or the other of two penetrating sharp force wounds to her body. One of them was in her abdomen, one of them was in her upper chest. The medical examiner said either one of these would have been fatal, but it's difficult to say how they would have been fatal because so much time has passed. The defense jumps right on this and brings out that the medical examiner cannot rule out the possibility that she stabbed herself, which I think is a long shot, but again, something that could be raised to the jury, to a juror who maybe was skeptical of the evidence in the case. Next, the defense focuses in on the DNA and all of those profiles and the comparisons that were made with the items that were found in the garage. And I should point out there were also profiles of Celeste's DNA found in the rear trunk of Burke's Tesla. Her remains were found in the front trunk. There was what appeared to be blood in the lower rear trunk, and swabs of that area returned to her genetic profile. But on the whole, the defense could also argue those are of limited help to the prosecution because these are all places where both Celeste and Burke were known to be. Sometimes DNA discoveries can be really helpful if the person whose DNA profile is found was not someone who was supposed to be at a particular location. That's like when you have a stranger murder and this stranger's DNA is all over a crime scene, and this is not a place they would have ever had access to other than the murder itself or the crime itself. That's really compelling evidence. In this case, the defense can argue that you don't know what kind of DNA this was, taking advantage of the fact that while the profiles themselves are very exacting, there's no question it was Celeste and it was Burke. There isn't great information about how those profiles got there. Not to get it too far into the weeds of this, but DNA is not time-stamped. There's no way to know how to age it. There's no way to know how long it was in a particular place. There's no way to know if the DNA profiles that were found came from blood or saliva or touch. Chances are they came from blood, and certainly that's what the prosecution was presenting because those swabs that returned the DNA profiles were taken from places where the criminalists thought they saw red stains that tested presumptively positive for blood, but it's not conclusive. So there's no way to know when the DNA was deposited. And certainly the defense will try to make an argument about the fact that she was in the house. We all know that, which would also seem to bolster the prosecution's argument for the sexual abuse claim charge, but that's a separate issue. So then the third major defense angle has to do with all the text messages. Remember, Detective Corey Farrell's on the witness stand for more than seemed like a day, or over a 2-day period, describing all of these text exchanges between Celeste and Burke. And after the defense, on cross-examination with the medical examiner, raised this idea that, isn't it possible Celeste had harmed herself and that's why she died? They also tried to raise the idea that she could have been despondent or was despondent about this relationship with Burke. And I should pause and just say, I don't like using the word relationship. I don't know what other word to use because she's a child, he's an adult. You can't have this kind of relationship. It just doesn't exist. This is an abusive situation. There's no other way to describe it, but I'm going to use the term relationship here because it kind of characterizes what certainly Burke thought was going on and certainly what Celeste to some degree thought was going on. So on cross-examination, this LAPD detective Farrell confirms that Celeste had sent a lot of messages to Burke angry about the state of their relationship. That at some points she had threatened violence, she'd threatened to mutilate him, she'd threatened to strangle him, and then ultimately, in the day before she disappears, threatens to expose this relationship that the two of them had. So on an argument to a jury, the defense could suggest or just claim that she was the one who was more angry because there are no text messages that the prosecution introduced where Burke is threatening her with any kind of violence. So it is possible that the defense could argue she was the instigator of the messages, she was the instigator of the violence on the day she died based on some of the things that she had threatened in previous text messages. They also tried to cross-examine the detective about other text messages that referenced her mental well-being and whether or not she had ever contemplated self-harm. So all of this, when you put all of those things together, clearly suggests that the defense is going to try to argue, if this case is in front of a jury, that Celeste's death may have begun in a different way than the way prosecutors are suggesting, and that maybe she had a hand in it, which you can only imagine how Celeste's parents, who were sitting there in court while a lot of this was going on, would think. So at the end of the preliminary hearing, the defense moves to dismiss all of the criminal charges. This was unsuccessful. The judge said, no, there's enough, or the word is sufficient evidence to move the case along. But the defense paid special attention to the three special circumstance allegations in the case, saying that they weren't supported by nearly enough evidence to meet legal standards. And it seems like this is a ripe area that the defense wants to attack if this case goes to a trial. It's also possible the defense may try to do something to challenge these charges again before they even get to a trial, given the judge's ruling that there was sufficient evidence and the defense believes there are not. Those special circumstances are lying in wait, murder for financial gain, and murder of a potential witness. The defense cited a lot of different case law that has to do with what has to be shown in order for someone to be successfully prosecuted for those special circumstance allegations. So let's leave it there. The judge rejected all of the defense arguments, again found that there was sufficient evidence for a jury trial. So the next time we may hear about all of this is when the defense begins to present its case. It did not present an affirmative defense at the preliminary hearing. The defense was only challenging what was brought out by the prosecution. Burke was sent back to jail, no bail. His next hearing is August 31st. That's when he'll come back to court, and he has to enter pleas to these charges for a second time. It's a in the federal system, it's called a post-indictment arraignment. In the state court, it's after you're held over for trial at a preliminary hearing. You get to enter pleas for a second time. And then the judge is going to set a schedule and the calendar for pre-trial hearings and all of that. It's possible it could happen quickly. Just a rough guess is that it'll probably be in 2027, but certainly it's possible that trial could be scheduled to begin in late 2026. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. I'll see you next time.